Выступить с докладом, с лекцией перед вами, дорогие студенты. Директор Европейского банка по связям с общественностью Джонатан Чарльз. Давайте поприветствуем его. Также сегодня с нами находится глава Европейского банка, представитель в Азербайджане Макеев. В кабинете, несколько минут говорили. Я сказала нашим дорогим гостям, что у нас замечательные студенты, они очень мотивированные, они интересуются всем, что происходит в той сфере, о которой сейчас будет говорить господин Джонатан. И думаю, что вам будет интересно, вы будете внимательно все слушать и будете задавать свои вопросы, воспользуйтесь такой замечательной возможностью, которую нам предоставили наши дорогие гости. Так что я вас оставляю и надеюсь, что эта встреча пойдет на пользу вам и также оставит очень хорошее впечатление наших гостей. Прошу слово. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great honour that you've invited me here to speak to you today. I hope that your English is good enough to understand what I'm saying. I will try to speak as clearly as I can. I really wanted to speak today not just about my experience with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I wanted to look further back. And I spent 30 years as a journalist with the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, where I was a foreign correspondent for the BBC, and I was a presenter of the main television news on the BBC. And I did that up until last year when I joined the EBRD. So I wanted to really take a look back at history and try to talk a little bit about the connection between history and technology. And why I wanted to speak about this is because this week I'm here in Baku speaking at the Internet Governance Forum, which is taking place in Baku, the IGF, the United Nations IGF, where we're talking about technology as well. And it made me think very hard about this connection between technology and history. And in this day and age, we're all very used to clicking on the computer and getting whatever we want. If we want to find out what is happening in some faraway country, we put into the Google search, wherever, and it comes up. And the world is at our fingertips. And I wanted to think a little bit about what that really means. What does it mean for our lives? And what was it like before that? In the period, really, before many of you were born. The period when I was first a foreign correspondent. And if I think back to 30 years ago, it was a world where we didn't know very much about very much. We read a little bit in newspapers. The people in my country, the United Kingdom, or listening on the BBC overseas radio service, would know a little bit because reporters like me would go to countries and they would tell them about something happening in those countries. But we really didn't know very much. So imagine that time where we had very limited sources of information, where it would take very many weeks for an event to be known beyond the immediate circle of where it was happening. A little under 30 years ago, I paid my first visit to what was then the Soviet Union. It was for the funeral of Konstantin Chernenko, the then leader of the Soviet Union. No one knew that he was dead. Because in those days, if a Soviet leader died, there was no Twitter to immediately report it, or no Facebook. The authorities tried to keep these things a little bit under control, and they would not reveal it. And one morning I was in London as the BBC reporter, when the senior editor of the BBC came to me and said, "We think the Soviet leader is dead. We think Konstantin Chernenko is dead, but we don't know." Why do we think this? Well, some diplomat in Britain has heard a rumour. But the Soviet authorities are not saying anything, and of course the Soviet leader is not saying anything. So we think we'd better try to get you a visa to come to Russia. So I got a visa to come to Moscow, one of several BBC reporters coming to Moscow. And we arrived in Moscow for the funeral, except no one had yet announced there was going to be a funeral. Because there was no social media, the news was very heavily controlled. It was a world where information was severely restricted. It was a world where technology was very restricted compared to today. But what I want to tell you this afternoon is that really shaped our view of the world. Because information was very restricted, because there wasn't all the information that's available now at the click of a computer, the world to us at that time seemed very big. Because actually a long way away really was a long way away. You couldn't find out what was happening there. So the world seemed big, but it also seemed simple. And why did it seem big and simple? Well, it seemed big for the reason that I've told you. It seemed simple because the world was really, as we saw it, two competing blocks. You had the Soviet Union and its allies, and you had the West. And when you looked at how news evolved, how events evolved, we used to think as reporters on many news stories, how does that fit between the competition between East and West? And so it was very simple to understand the world, because it was two blocks competing for geopolitical power. And it was very easy to understand. So where does technology come into all this? Well, if I think of 30 years ago, of course, it was very easy to control that world, because if information is not very prevalent, then it's very easy to actually restrict what people know. So at that moment, when I was standing in Moscow, not knowing whether Chernenko was dead, of course he was dead. He had been dead for some days, certainly for a couple of days probably. But no one had yet announced his death. And then the death was announced on the state media with nice classical music, very somber television broadcast. And then as a BBC correspondent I could go and witness the state funeral of Konstantin Chernenko. So technology. Well, it's hard to imagine today, isn't it, that if Konstantin Chernenko had died today, it would be all over Twitter. It would be all over Facebook. Everyone would know about it. And everyone would be talking about it. They would be writing tweets. They would be writing on social media what they think about all this. I think going back 30 years in this world that was big but simple, technology played its part in changing that world. It was very clear to me 30 years ago as a reporter, landing in Moscow, in this very dark capital city, because Moscow was very dark compared to cities in the West. There wasn't all the bright neon lights, all the trappings that we're used to today of consumer society. It was very clear to me that one reason why the Soviet Union was going to fail was technology, in two ways. One was that the Soviet Union was trying very hard to keep up with Western military technology because it needed to keep a balance of power. But that was very expensive, cripplingly expensive for an economy. At the same time, it was also very clear to me from travelling around, not just then, but in the years that followed, in travelling around countries which belonged to the Soviet bloc, like Communist East Germany, like Poland, that these countries all wanted Western technology, that their consumers, ordinary people in the streets, they wanted the things that they knew people in the West had. They wanted better televisions, better fridges, better radios, better cars. The technology gap was great. It was great on a military sense, and it was great on a consumer sense. That gap was big between East and West. And in the end, it becomes unsustainable for countries to carry on denying people the opportunity to have these equal technology opportunities. And that was one reason. There were many reasons why the Soviet Union failed. But it struck me as I was travelling around that one reason why it failed was technology. And if I went to, as I often did, Communist East Germany during that period in the 1980s, people there, especially if they were in the Berlin area, used to be able to watch Western German television. And so every night, they would see these adverts for Western technology, Western consumer adverts on West German television. And they would see, wow, you mean you can have a record player like that? You can have a car like that. This is unbelievable. And they realized that their society, their economy, could not provide that. So technology played a big part in the change of the world from 30 years ago to today. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was in Berlin for that event as a BBC foreign correspondent. And I think we were a bit stupid as Westerners. I think we felt in London, in Paris, in Washington, okay, so now the world has changed. It's going to be automatically a better world. We are going to see a world in which there aren't these two blocks competing for power. We're going to see a world in which comes together, in which we know a lot more about each other. And if we know a lot more about each other, that can only be good. Technology will help us know a lot more about each other, because technology will be shared. The good technology of the West will be available to everyone, and so people will become much closer. The world could become smaller. So at that point, we thought a smaller world, but still a simple world. The past world we've known for the Cold War would be gone. The world, I certainly remember as a child growing up in the 1960s in Britain, seeing a newspaper report in a British newspaper called the Sunday Express when I was probably about 8 years old, at a time when we were all worried about nuclear conflict. One day, could there accidentally be some nuclear war between East and West? And I remember reading in a British newspaper from a newspaper reporter who had been in Moscow and somehow had managed to speak to ordinary Russians, probably with the help of the Soviet authorities, and they were expressing exactly the same fears that we felt in the West, the fear of accidental nuclear war. And I remember reading that and thinking, thank God they feel the same things that we do. Maybe there won't be any nuclear conflict because actually they're just like us. But whereas now, I know that many people around the world are just like me. I can see that on social media. Then the technology was not there to allow people to come together. So we thought in 1989 that the world would be this better place. And it would be a lot easier to do. Well, of course, we were wrong. The world was a better place in some ways, and the world has become a better place in some ways. But now, of course, we live in this world through technology, which is actually smaller than that big world of 30 years ago, but much more complex. That we know that the world is more complex, that we know that the advantage of having two blocks competing for power 30 years ago was that in a way, the two blocks kept the world in order. Because the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, their influence controlled large parts of the world. And they made sure that in the parts of the world where they had influence, that people behaved. And now we live in a world which is a bit more chaotic and a bit more anarchic. I knew as a BBC reporter when I covered terrorism acts, for example, in the 1980s, involving Palestinian terror groups fighting for a Palestinian state. And I went to many aircraft hijackings where aircraft had been hijacked by Palestinian terrorists. That those Palestinian terrorists, when they hijacked aircraft, on the whole, they really didn't want to kill anyone. They knew that there was a limit to how far they wanted to go. They wanted to get publicity for their cause. They wanted to let the world know they had a reason for doing this, but only in the last possible resort would they want to kill him. Now you contrast that with terror groups today, who are quite happy to carry out suicide bombs, because the world has changed. And in this more complex world, in this world where there is much more information, they feel that in order for someone to take notice of them, they have to do something more extreme. Because we have so much more information and we know so much more about the world now than was possible 30 years ago, that you have to shout louder to be heard in a way you didn't have to 30 years ago. There's not much, if people don't know very much about what's going on, then an event doesn't have to be that big for it to become news. Today, there is so much going on, and we know about it instantly. That actually, if you really want to be noticed, you have to shout a lot louder. And that's, of course, what happens in terrorist events today. I was the BBC correspondent at Beslan when Chechen rebels took over school number 1 in Beslan in September 2004 and held all the children and the pupils, their families who were visiting on the first day of school, and teachers hostage in this school in southern Russia. Those people knew, the Chechen rebels, that if the world was to take notice of what they were saying, that they wanted a free Chechnya, whatever they might be saying, they knew they would have to kill everyone, because that's the only way in this world of modern technology, where we know so much through modern technology, that they were going to get their message across. That's what I mean about the world being smaller, and at the same time more complex. It's smaller because what was going on in Chechnya, or what was going on in Beslan, could be seen in real time, as it happened, by people living all around the world. If they tuned into their television stations in the United States, in France, in Germany, in Britain, they would see me and other foreign correspondents standing there explaining this was happening right now over here. In a way, again, 30 years ago you couldn't have done. So technology makes that possible, but at the same time, technology produces a cacophony of noise, which sometimes it's quite hard to decide what is important and what is not. but it certainly means everyone is shouting louder to be heard in this smaller but more complex world. In economies, what does it mean? Some of you here are probably studying economics. We have far more information available right now immediately to decide on an economic course in this small but more complex world than we would have done 30 years ago. When I studied economics more than 30 years ago, the information we had available about what was happening in an economy right now was quite small. The statistics that we would use to take economic decisions were often weeks or months out of date. Now, if you take a decision, if you want to look at what you think the economy is doing right now, again, use technology. You go straight to the computer. You have a world of information at your fingertips about what this company is doing, what that company is doing, how the micro situation adds up to the macro. Technology is aiding decision making. But again, it is overloading us with information. 30 years ago, when I was a foreign correspondent, you were pretty much the only source of information for society. So it was really possible to help people understand a little bit of this big but simple world. Now, you have all the information you need. You don't need a journalist to tell you what to think about it. But the difficulty is, it's much more difficult in this small but complex world to decide what is important and what isn't. Because you've got all the information. How do you decide? 30 years ago, someone like me would have been on television saying this is important. Now you've got all this information, but how do you decide what's important and what isn't? And I think that is one of the issues raised by technology. Having said all that, I think the world is a much better place for technology. I think it's great that if I want to know more about the people of Azerbaijan, modern technology. If I want to know more about the people of Azerbaijan, yes, I look on my computer, and it brings the world much more closely together. And I think generally that the more people know about each other, then the better chance we have for a better world. It is really important, I think, that societies invest in technology. I think in this world, again, that we live in now, it's certainly in large parts of the world where governments are cutting their spending. In Europe, for example, where there are economic difficulties, sometimes in the United States as well, that they do not stop that investment in technology. Because technology is what societies need to make massive advances. If you look at your own country, 30 years ago, could you have made the very big advances that your country is making now? No, you couldn't. To give one example, telecommunications. 30 years ago, they were with this old Soviet telephone system that barely worked. If you had to decide now to update that telephone system, it would be a huge task. But the advantage of modern technology, of mobile technology, of digital technology, is you can forget about that old system and instead have 3G telephone networks or 4G telephone networks in large parts of the world. You are making a big technological leap forward in a way that just would not have been possible 30 years ago. What I would say to you, I think, is your generation takes this for granted because you have grown up with technology changing very, very quickly. But don't take it for granted. Remember that world of 30 years ago where no one knew very much about anything, where the world seemed simpler, but actually it was pretty big. And there are a lot of benefits, both economic and political now, in the world being smaller. It may be more complex, it requires a lot more effort to work out what's going on. But actually, that's not a bad price to pay for all the benefits of modern technology and for the change that modern technology will bring. I say this really because I was thinking, what could I possibly say to a group of students? What would it be worth you hearing? I could talk in great detail about what the EBRD does. We're very keen on technology too. We invest all over our countries of operations, including here in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is a shareholder of the EBRD, of my organisation, as well as a beneficiary. The bank was set up with the fall of that very simple world, the fall of the communist bloc, to help countries like yours really make big improvements economically. And we've had a big success doing that across the former Soviet Union. And we will invest in technology. It's very, very important. So I could have spoken about that. But actually, I think the only thing I can give you is a reminder not to take all that technology that we have today for granted. To remember a world where we didn't have it, where it seemed in some ways like an easier world, but actually we get so many benefits today from technology. And we take it for granted. So I suppose my plea to you, as students who will make the next technological leap forward possible, you're the generation who will move the economy on again and technology on again, is do not take all this for granted. Remember that time, which was before you were born, when people knew nothing about very much. And that's not a great world to live. I'd love to have your questions. If you want to ask me any questions, then please do. Thank you. And there's translation for questions, by the way.
По вопросам будет перевод, поэтому задавайте, пожалуйста, ваши вопросы, если таковые есть.
Don't be shy, I won't fight.
Не будьте робкими, задавайте вопросы.
Please feel free to ask any questions you like.
Пожалуйста, любой вопрос, который у вас может возникнуть.
Yes, please say who you are.
Что господин Джонсон может нам посоветовать еще, помимо того, чтобы работать над собой, чтобы достичь таких же целей, достичь таких же целей, как вы, в экономической сфере, в частности?
А что вы изучаете?
Предлагаем математику. Нравится?
Okay, that's a very good topic to study.
Очень хорошая тема.
Well, I think studying hard is great. That's fine.
Я думаю, что хорошо, когда человек учится очень усердно, и это здорово.
It is necessary for success, but not sufficient for success.
Это необходимо для успеха, но недостаточно для успеха.
I studied,
Я сам учился,
and it's great.
и учился хорошо.
But I also worked much harder, I think, at thinking about the world around me.
Но я думаю, что также мне пришлось очень много работать в контексте того мира, который меня окружает.
You can have all the academic study in the world.
Можно, пройти все академические изучения в мире.
But it is not necessarily enough to understand the world.
Но не всегда этого будет достаточно для того, чтобы понять мир, который вокруг нас.
Especially this complex world that I keep talking about.
Особенно тот сложный мир, о котором я говорил.
So I would say to anyone studying